modern day countries that we know about, England and France, really start to develop and become what we kind of know them as today, right? So starting with England, right, it is kind of the oldest groups present there on the island are the Anglo-Saxons, and they're actually Germanic tribes. So they come over towards the end of the Roman Empire, right, and they start settling in what we call England today, right? And the Angles, which is where we get Anglo from, that's where the name England comes from, Angle land. And then by the 900s, beginning of the 900s, you have the Vikings, which the English and the French called the Northmen, right? They begin invading and pillaging the island of England. So we have a mixture now of Germanic tribes and Viking, the Scandinavian tribes, coming into England. England and France, right? Because the Vikings kind of invaded and pillaged all throughout Europe. And so eventually, in the year 1066, a man named William of Normandy, which is a region in France, Normandy actually comes from the word Northmen as well, and William of Normandy would be a descendant of the Vikings, and so they invade England. And in 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, William of Normandy essentially wins the crown of England, and creates kind of a new kingdom, right, with control of the island of England and some territory in Normandy as well. Later on down the line, a descendant of William of Normandy, Henry II, marries a woman named Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Eleanor kind of gives Henry more land and more access in France. So his empire in England is expanding to control parts of France as well. And we actually know Henry II's son, Richard the Lionhearted, from the discussion on the Crusades. So here we have a map of this medieval world here. You can see that France at the time is not a united country of France. If you look at the purple region around Paris, that's actually all that is part of the King of France's territory. So in theory, he controls all of it, but in reality, all these different lords and nobles control different parts of France, right? And the red coloring here is the possessions of William I of Normandy in 1066. So his kind of home base, right, in Normandy there in northern France, he invades and conquers England, right? And eventually, the French are going to kind of consolidate and grow their power to control all these smaller different regions. So we talk about medieval England. A really important document that's written is called the Magna Carta, which is translated to the Great Charter, right? And this was really important for what it does for the people of England. So Henry II, right, we said, he has two sons, at least two sons. He actually had four children. Two of them are Richard the Lionhearted and John. And so Richard Lionhearted goes off to fight the Crusades, right? Comes back. When he dies, after Henry II, he was the oldest, so he became king. But after he dies, excuse me, John becomes king. So King John is kind of in charge during the era when the Magna Carta is written. He is a weak ruler, and the lords take advantage of that, right? And they force King John to sign something called the Magna Carta in the year 1215. And the Magna Carta is really important because it guarantees certain protections and rights. Originally, these rights are just for the nobles, so like certain rights to property, a trial by jury, all these different things are guaranteed to the noble people in England. Gradually, and very gradually, these rights start to get spread across other people in society. So it goes from just the nobles to the wealthy commoners, merchants, and artisans, and up to the modern day, right, to all people kind of have these basic rights that were originally laid out in the Magna Carta. So it's kind of one of the founding documents of democracy in England, even though it takes a while for that to actually happen. Another important development during the Middle Ages, about the 1300s, early 1300s, is the formation of what we now know as Parliament, which is the representative body of the people in England. So it starts with the need for money. King Edward I, a king of England during this time, he needed money to fight the Scottish and the Welsh, which were two other groups of people living on the island of England, or Britain, I should say. And so he needed money to raise an army. He didn't have enough himself. And so what he does, he calls in all the nobles and all the wealthy merchants, all those wealthy commoners together in England to kind of have them vote and agree to give him money. Right? And eventually these two groups of people evolve into two houses that still exist in Parliament today in England, the House of Lords, which are the nobles, and the House of Commons, which are the non-nobles. At this point in time, in the early 1300s, it's wealthy merchants, still wealthy, powerful people, but people who don't have titles to their names, like knight or sir or lady, things like that. And this is the beginnings of the parliament system that still exists in England today. And over time, this parliament, originally it was called by King Edward I, so it's called by the monarchs, and the monarchs have a lot of power over it. But over time, they actually come to limit the power of the king, because they have something called the power of the purse, right? And this is really powerful. Whoever has the ability to dish out money, right, is the one who's going to have the power. And so these nobles start refusing to give money to the king, or limiting the amount of money they give to the king in exchange for the king allowing certain rights and freedom. So it's a way for them to kind of gain leverage with the monarchy. And over time, like I said, it limits the power of the king and eventually, very gradually, leads to a democratic system. So moving now over to the mainland of Europe, into France, we have the end of the Carolingian dynasty, which is Charlemagne was part of that, right? And the beginning of the Capetian dynasty with Hugh Capet. One of his descendants, a man named Philip II, or Philip Augustus, and another name that should sound familiar because we talked about him when we talked about the Crusades. He conquers Normandy, taking that territory was originally controlled by William and his descendants, right? He takes it from England and makes it part of the French kingdom, right? So kind of kicking the English out of mainland Europe, mainland France. Ways to increase his own power, he sends something called a royal bailiff, someone who is only loyal to him, the king, out to the different nobles in different lands to hear cases and collect taxes, right? So instead of relying on local nobles to do that and then cheating the system, he sends his own officials who are paid by him and are loyal to him only to do these things. So that increases his power over the lords and nobles of France. Another descendant, a member of the Capetian dynasty, is a man named Louis IX. This is actually Philip's grandson. He helps to further increase the size of France, gaining direct control for the king. And he's known as Louis the Pious, and is actually eventually named a Catholic saint. So the Saint Louis the Pious was a French king. He also helped to create a French appeals court. Essentially, people could appeal the verdict that the nobles passed down to the king, right, to that higher level, and that further weakened the power of the nobles. So similarly to England, France develops a kind of a representative body known as the Estates General, and there are three different estates in France, in French society. There was the clergy, the first estate, the nobles, the second estate, and the commoners. Pretty much everyone else was the third estate. And so in 1302, King Philip IV calls together this Estates General because he also needs money, right? Just like Edward needed money in England, Philip needs it in France. Right? As in England, it could have been a way to limit the king, but for certain reasons, it's not as effective. And the king only calls this Estates General very sporadically, and it does not have the same power as Parliament does in England. So whereas the English Parliament eventually leads to democracy and limits the power of the king, the Estates General does not effectively limit the power of the king in France.